And welcome to Making Sense of Learning and Teaching and New Technologies. And this is our penultimate week. We have one more week next week where we'll be going through the remainder of the course content. But this week, we're exploring emerging learning systems and different pedagogical approaches, and particularly looking at a concept called socio-ecological modeling, which is a way of expanding upon our systems analysis to better understand the various influences and stakeholders involved in any educational reform, particularly to educational technology in our case, and that you'll be able to use in your second assignment. So we have a number of readings, and we'll go through those tonight. And at the moment, we've only got Eric with us, so either it'll be a fairly short session or some others will join us and we'll continue on with our discussions. Now, you should all have received feedback on your first assignment and be now thinking, of course, about your second assignment. Remembering, of course, that your first assignment can lead into your second assignment, particularly the systems analysis that you've done and some of your thinking about the innovations that you might want to implement in an educational environment or an educational setting or organization. So before I get started on that, Eric, is there any questions you have about the assignment or any other elements before we get into the readings for this evening? Okay. So the first reading we have goes through and details a process for achieving an educational reform or an initiative in a learning environment. And they've called it a roadmap, but it's the various things that you can consider when you look at your second assignment in terms of your implementation plan. And this will hopefully help you flesh out your concepts and broaden the different perspectives that you bring to that implementation plan to take into consideration a whole range of other factors that you may not have thought about at this stage. Now, it's broken into 5 different sections. Let me just get down to the summary of them. So, assessment and accountability, leadership and culture, learning, teaching and professional learning, and infrastructure. So there they are in that summary. And we'll go through each of those and consider what you may be able to draw upon to help develop your own implementation plans. So the first one, which is always the focus of any educational group, is around learning. Now, let's get to that one. So there's been a lot of initiatives around learning over the last few years. Whole lot of things around new literacies and the idea that we need to develop for students a whole range of capabilities that weren't part of the traditional educational system, or the 3 R's as they were sort of known: reading, writing, and arithmetic. So there's a whole range of new skills that students are expected to emerge from our educational systems, ready to be able to engage with when they go into employment or into life in general, or even further study. And it's good to see we've got Damien and I think it's Sarah joining us now. So we'll be able to have some more in-depth discussion. But okay, so looking at these various perspectives, there's a whole range of things that you need to consider from a pedagogical perspective when you develop your implementation plans as to what you want to see happen with learning in your educational organization. So let me again get to the little summary. And this is nicely broken down into stages. And as you may recall, for your second assignment, you'll also be expected to develop up a staged approach of 1, 5, and 10 years of how you're going to implement your reform or your initiative in that organization. So a couple of the concepts that they've identified around learning would be giving students agency and voice in the organisation and being able to have a say in what actually occurs in their learning and in the educational environment overall, how the school or university or whatever other organisation you're looking at is run, how to engage them and get them interested in their learning, how to be rigorous and make sure that the learning is at a high standard and really developing students' understanding about different concepts, making sure that there's a good depth and breadth of the learning so that it's not too narrow and focused on just a couple of specific learning areas, but also that it goes into a significant depth so that students have got a chance not just to look at superficially across a whole range of areas, but to go into some depth into particular areas. Whether or not it's flexible and adaptive and can change related to students' interest or teacher expertise or organisational focus. There's a whole range of things that you can build into your organisation to ensure that that can occur. Whether the assessment is as of or for learning. Okay. Ideally, assessment should be incorporated into the learning process and not seen as an add-on or an addition. And whether or not it's open-ended and self-directed, whether or not we're preparing students for after their formal education to when they have to be independent learners and engage with learning on their own initiative. And then a few more, whether or not it's connected to the real world and the experiences and activities that the students are engaged with are based on what actual happens in the professions or industry or just their society. Whether or not it's anywhere and any time, so whether or not students have to come to school and learn at specific periods of time that are scheduled, or whether or not they could learn from anywhere, from home or from local libraries or when they're traveling or in hospital, and whether or not they can learn anytime during the school day or at home or on the weekend or at a whole range of other flexible processes that can be built in. And whether or not they're hyper-connected and mobile, whether or not students are actually engaged with lots of other people, other students, teachers, academics, people all around the world, and linking into their own professional communities to assist with their learning. So that's a whole range of concepts. There's a range of questions that you can consider and some things around policy considerations. Now, these are particularly important for you in your thinking about how you would implement some of these in your own educational settings. And the document goes into more detail and fleshes out some of those and provides a series of examples or exemplars of how some of these initiatives have been implemented in various educational environments. And you can have a look at some of their case studies and see the examples that they've detailed about that. So that's learning. Does anyone have any thoughts about any aspects of learning that you're considering putting into your implementation plans? And welcome, Emma.
Learning anywhere, like with the learner management system, you can learn not just at school, but at home.
Yes, absolutely.
You always have access to all of the materials if you need to revise things or you get set homework tasks, etc.
So yes, if you're focusing in on learning management systems and how they can be implemented in an organization, that whole concept of allowing students to learn at any time, but that can also challenge even learning management systems. So for example, this course, we're scheduled to attend at particular times. That doesn't necessarily always have to be the case. You can develop more flexible course structures where students can engage with. Of course, that can make it more difficult to have groups come together and have discussions, but there are lots of examples where learning management systems and other tools and techniques are used to facilitate anytime learning.
I was thinking like you could use it for differentiation as well. So you can learn anywhere, but you can also in school learn, but have different pathways. Some students need to be accelerated and some the reverse.
Now that's a different concept, and I didn't see it in the list there, but the whole aspect of differentiation, it may come up in further elements. But yes, that ability to be able to allow students to progress on different learning pathways and at different rates, and also pursuing different interests, is a very powerful application of technology. Of course, a teacher with a class of 30 students or so, it's very difficult to facilitate differentiation if you're doing direct instruction. But if you've got students working through learning management systems that are providing that direct instruction, or working on projects in other pedagogical approaches, it's easier to facilitate a differentiated or individualized learning pathways. Eric, Sarah, or Emma, do you have any thoughts around the learning aspects of what you may be considering implementing in your own implementation plans? Okay, so Eric's looking at social media learning and concepts around that, and the use of YouTube. Yep, they can all be interesting. Remember, we're talking here about technology, so you need to also consider how it may affect the actual processes of student learning. And Emma mentions, she hasn't quite decided upon some yet, but personal learning spaces of some kind are what you're thinking of focusing on. And yes, again, that can be a very important pedagogical approach. Again, often helping students with differentiated learning pathways. But also, learning spaces can be incorporated even into physical environments, with a whole range of approaches now being done to allow students to customize the space of their learning. But that can also extend into the virtual, where students can customize their own digital portfolios or e-learning platforms, or a whole range of other aspects where giving students a say in how they actually manage their engagement with content and with interactions with others can extend to their design and structuring of the tools that they use. It doesn't always have to be decided upon by the teachers. And you want to look at something that will allow offline learning via technology too. And absolutely, offline learning was around long before online learning, and there's a whole area around the use of recorded material on CDs or back to videotapes or audio tapes. So there's all those aspects. But yeah, predominantly the move is around online learning because of its advantages in replicatability and being able to be distributed more easily. But many of the techniques and approaches used in online learning can also be applied to offline learning environments where the infrastructure doesn't support that. But we'll get to infrastructure in a little bit. Who haven't we heard from? Sarah, do you have any thoughts around how the learning might change in your implementation plan? Hi. Okay. We might want to think about that, and we'll get back to you on that in a little bit. So let's now look at the next section. So this is around the teachers themselves, okay? The actual people that are going to be doing the teaching or facilitating the learning with the students, and a range of different approaches that can be used to support teachers. So, and again, this is broken up into stages, which you may be able to utilize in your own implementation plans. Now, for the teachers, it focuses in on learning, which is obviously a very strong focus of teachers. But allowing teachers to actually describe the processes of learning, the content that the teachers understand, so helping teachers better master the content material of what they're going to be teaching, or providing access to other supporting mechanisms that can assist with that, like digital resources or experts and things of that nature. Assisting teachers develop their pedagogy and different approaches to teaching. The learning environment, which we just talked a bit about, that a whole range of different things that we can support teachers in structuring their learning environments. Very popular in K-12 schools at the moment around use of different types of furniture and restructuring the learning spaces away from desks in rows towards more flexible and independent learning spaces. And that can have a very strong influence on the pedagogy being applied in those spaces. But it can also be done in a virtual space. We often expect all students to engage with a very uniform virtual environment. But virtual environments can be individualized and made flexible for students, where they can, there's trivial things like changing the colors and the backgrounds and all that sort of stuff. But in more complex learning management systems, students can actually rearrange things. The Blackboard environment has gone down that path a little bit, where you can set up your own dashboards and decide what sort of information appears on the main screen when you first log on, and just organize things so that it's a bit more user-friendly. But it could go even further, such as being able to put in your own Facebook feeds or your Instagram feeds and have other things added into that space that wouldn't necessarily be things that the teacher might want to see have there, but are things that you would like to have included. It could be sports scores or a whole range of other things that would be important for particular students. Then there's a whole aspect around professional learning and assisting teachers expand their content knowledge, their pedagogy knowledge, and also the conditions under which they can access professional learning. Now, some of that might be through online learning or bringing in experts to assist them, but it can also be developing up communities of learners where teachers learn from each other. And that can be done internally in a school, or it could also be done where teachers engage with wider communities, even to global communities. So various things that you can consider around how you may transform the way that teachers keep up to date and engage with various elements of the implementation plan that you're considering. And does anyone have any thoughts about how they would incorporate some of those aspects into their own personal implementation plans for your assignment 2? Hopefully, if you're introducing a new technology, then you'll be thinking about how to actually prepare your staff, the teachers, to engage with that technology. And that will often involve some sort of professional development or learning community.
Yep, so I've considered that as well, and one thing that I thought was really important is to make sure that there's allocated funding for any professional development. So therefore, instead of teachers saying, I need professional development and I'd like to do this, like as a self-directed thing, and then the school's saying, well, we don't have funds allocated for that, so we can't actually do it. So to make sure that it all comes back to funding, really, in schools. If you want professional development to happen, you need the money to pay for it, like to replace the teachers. So you need to make sure there's adequate level of that in the school budget to allow the change to happen. Sometimes it's overlooked, and teachers are expected to do things outside of their school working hours.
Now, absolutely, and it's an important thing to build into your plans. There's a whole range of strategies around that. Some of it may be where teachers bid upon a pool of money and put forward their ideas for professional learning, and it's then distributed out. Other processes are allocating every teacher a certain amount and having them come up with their own professional learning plans that can go towards your implementation process. But there's also processes whereby you could look at the internal expertise of staff and how they can share their knowledge with other teachers within the school.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. Like it would probably be, and it's becoming more often I've seen in schools where they have one person that runs the technology and how to get it happening with everyone, rather than relying on teachers to self-direct, or relying on deputies or hawks or the sort of people that have other responsibilities to add on to it. They actually define a role and put that teacher in that position, and that's all they do, is to develop support teachers and to help with professional development as well. So, but that's also the, what's important for the school and how much staff are you allowed to have at the school, and back to funding again. It's always about money, I suppose.
Well, money does make things happen. But yes, the whole train-the-trainer process and having specialist teachers or learning support teachers in the various roles and names is an important transition process. But it should always be aimed at enabling staff to eventually no longer need those people. There'll be some new innovation that you'll need new people for in the future in any event. But processes whereby it's built in and not transition towards no longer needing them is a problematic approach. And hopefully your implementation plans, if they're including specialist teachers or specialist roles, will be so that those teachers are aimed at enabling the staff to eventually no longer require those specialist roles. In the main, that's the approach that's adopted universally, although we do still have some specialist teachers in some areas simply because of the complexity of knowledge required to be able to distribute those skills across all staff members, such as music teachers or specialist sports teachers. But in the main, ICT and technology skills should be those that are eventually adopted by all teachers. Yeah, there is arguments against that, but in the main, I think that's the general approach that's being adopted. Now, Eric also mentions professional teacher training for new pedagogy updates for school ICT hardware and software to take advantage of virtual reality resources and a decreased expenditure on placement. I'm not too sure what you mean by placement there, but yes, a whole range of approaches you need to consider when you're thinking about your implementation plan. Now, Emma mentions feedback and agreeing with everything that's been said. Yep, and yes. But the important thing about technology is that it's always evolving. 10 years ago, we would have had specialist teachers teaching teachers how to use video recorders or overhead projectors. And at that time, that was needed. But then as that technology became embedded, we then moved on to new technologies and then had specialist teachers for those. So we can never stay static in the world of technology, and that needs to be incorporated into your thinking around your implementation plans. And Emma also mentioned C2C requires technology for many aspects. And yes, well, the C2C framework, for those that aren't aware, was a set of curriculum resources developed for Queensland state schools to implement the Australian curriculum and basically guided lesson plans. And some of those did require some additional resources, although in the main, they tended to be fairly aimed at what every school could achieve. And that was certainly their brief. And that was somewhat one of the criticisms of the C2C material, in that many schools wanted to go well beyond what the C2C base expectations were, because they had additional equipment or expertise in their schools around pedagogies and other approaches and content knowledge. And Sarah was agreeing with everything. That's wonderful. And Damien mentions also used heavily for distance education. C2C, yes. Yes, very good framework, and it was designed to assist teachers in the transition to a new curriculum, providing them with a model of what an approach to actually teaching that curriculum, and has been widely used, but it was a transitionary process, and most schools and teachers, now that they've mastered that transition, are now looking at developing their own resources and returning back to normal approaches towards curriculum development. Okay, let's have a look at the next section. And again, lots of exemplars there that you can have a look at. So the next one is around assessment and accountability, actually measuring students' learning and making students and teachers accountable for that learning. So there's a range of approaches. Is there a nice table of these? Let's have a look. Here we are. So there's a whole range of assessment tools that we can utilize. And that may be as simple as online quizzes or computer-based quizzes using learning management systems, through to video assessments and other more complex assessment processes. And you could think about those aspects, but assessment is an important element of learning, and you need to consider how you're going to measure the achievements of your initiatives. And part of that will be around students learning, but it also may be around staff engagement with the initiatives that you're considering. It also might be around community engagement or whatever other processes that you've incorporated into your engagement plan or your implementation plan, and how you're going to measure the effectiveness of how those things are happening. But of course, in schools, as we're focused on education, the learning outcomes of students is one of the key areas that we need to keep a measurement of, and try to make that measurement as valid as possible without being intrusive or detrimental to the learning process. So measuring staff knowledge and readiness to engage with the approaches that you're talking about, the people's understanding about your policy in terms of your implementation plan. Have they actually read it? Do they know what it's saying? Does it match their beliefs and what they want to get out of the implementation plan? And that maybe need to be done at different levels. Certainly it's important to make sure that your parents and community are supportive of the implementation, but it can also extend to policymakers and the community. And some of this may be around creating promotional material for your implementation plan, videos and so forth. And if it's successful, you may have other schools wanting to hear about it, maybe come to visits and see your implementation plan in practice and how you share those ideas with others. And then there's other aspects around planning and compliance, which is all the regulatory processes that schools and classrooms need to address. And that could be at a simple level in terms of the curriculum, making sure that the students are learning what the curriculum has directed them to learn. But there are a whole range of other compliance processes. It might be around equity or other elements that schools need to make sure that they're addressing. One thing that's often missed in implementation plans is considering students with disabilities. If you've got students that have visual or auditory difficulties, are they going to be able to engage fully with the learning environment that you're creating? And how are you going to actually ensure that all of your students have got access to the full spectrum of learning? But that can also extend to staff. If you've got staff with particular challenges, it may be around vision or mobility or hearing, will they be able to engage fully with the technologies that you're implementing in your plan? Okay, so what are your thoughts in terms of including some of those concepts in your implementation plans? Has anyone thought about including aspects of assessment in your implementation plans? Emma mentions particularly assessment-based, but do look at the end results from creation. Do I look at the end results from creation? Do you want to just maybe explain that in a little bit more detail, Emma? Just in terms of what you're referring to there? Oh, the creation of artwork. Okay. No, absolutely. And artwork is commonly assessed, often in different ways, but it's certainly part of an assessment process of valuing the outputs and giving critique and guidance in terms of improvement. So there's all those elements that can be aspect, all the way down to potential monetary value of the artworks and having that as a measurement of success. So there's a whole range of things that could be incorporated into an assessment process. Yes, self-evaluation, but you might want to expand beyond self-evaluation because that can often be very subjective. But you've got access to a global community. You could have a website that displays students' artwork and get feedback from around the world, including feedback from practicing artists and experts. And there's lots of ways that you can build into that and have exhibitions and drawing upon the common ways that artists seek acknowledgement and feedback on their work as a form of assessment. Damien mentions Differentiation, again, very important around assessment, and one of the reasons why it's often challenged as an appropriate approach, because assessment is seen by some as needing to be uniform across all students, particularly when you want to compare students with other students. But that's not always the imperative behind assessment, and arguments can be put that there are other reasons for assessment other than just comparing and ranking students. But where that is a priority, then that does make challenges, and you then need to consider what common assessment elements can be incorporated into your assessment processes so that students can be effectively compared and ranked, and other aspects around assessment. And assessment, yes, Damien, can be used to tailor their learning, where you get dynamic feedback from students' progress and then present new learning pathways depending upon their demonstrated abilities through assessment tasks. And Eric mentions assessment for reporting and improvement to the curriculum. Absolutely, having that feedback mechanisms, but that feedback mechanism can extend beyond just the curriculum. It could be extended to your entire implementation plan, where you're seeking feedback from students and staff and the community and parents, and modify your implementation plan based on that feedback. And yes, Sarah, peer assessment is another valid approach. Again, it has some challenges and needs to be done effectively, but it can be a very cost-effective way of doing high quality assessment and feedback to students. Because a single teacher has only a certain amount of capacity to provide feedback to lots of students, and utilizing assessment as part of the learning process, particularly in things such as education, where we can actually use the assessment process to actually provide learning opportunities for students. But peer teaching and peer assessment can be a valid way for students to consolidate their learning in any subject area. But it does need extra effort to think through how to do that effectively and build that into the curriculum. Too often peer assessment is just done as an add-on rather than being an integral part of the learning process. And if it's just done as a way of having students do the job of the teacher, then it's probably an invalid use of student time, because you're really employing them to do assessment. And that's not really an ethical thing that should be supported. But it's not that difficult to actually build students assessing other students as part of their learning process. And it can be a very effective part of their learning process. Okay, let's move on and look at the next section. So lots of things in here that you could read and get more detail. And of course, looking at these exemplars, of course, your implementation plan is really just one of these exemplars. They're not all structured as you'll be structuring yours, but you can get lots of ideas by looking at how all of these different organizations have gone about implementing a particular approach based upon these various aspects. So accountability is done as a sort of slightly different section, but it's all the same concepts. Now, the leadership and the culture that you develop within your educational environment is the next section. So how in your implementation plan, you consider how to actually make a really positive, well-engaged learning organization that's in getting everyone on board, and we'll talk about more about that when we come to the socio-ecological modeling, but how to actually make a really dynamic, positive learning place. One of the major approaches is around distributed leadership. So you don't just have one person deciding upon everything, but allowing a whole range of people to have authentic say in how an organization is run. And this can be challenging, particularly when you extend that down to students in the community and parents, because they may have different views to what you have. And having a good, strong plan that can incorporate the views of others, but still get across the vision and the intent of what you want to achieve, can be challenging, but when it's done well, can be very, very effective. Having everyone engaged with your community and your implementation plan and being supportive of it is a big focus, and you'll see that coming through your assignment, where you're being asked to explicitly say how you're going to engage your community and get people on board with all their different perspectives and viewpoints and interests. Making sure you've got a focus on students. We often use this word student-centered, and without really understanding fully what it means. But a truly student-centered environment has the decisions, any decisions made are first considered from the perspective of the students and what they gain from the decision-making process. Very often we make decisions in educational environments because it makes it easier for the teachers or for the administration, particularly around timetabling or scheduling of classes or deciding what content is going to be taught. And that's not a student-centered environment. A student-centered environment first looks at, okay, what do students want to learn and need to learn? And that then dictates what is then taught. When do students want to learn and when's best for them to learn? That dictates then the timetabling. Challenging, but is what really should be aimed at when we're talking about student-centered environment. Building a trusting and safe, supportive environment is an important aspect. And a lot of this comes around getting people on board with your vision and allowing them to have a say and incorporating their ideas and opinions into your planning. But also maintaining that trust. It's not something you can really build into your implementation plan, but the old saying of it takes years to develop trust, but only seconds to lose it is a very true thing. And any good leadership team is very careful of not destroying trust and the supportive environments that are built up in schools. Building the collective vision we've talked about over the last couple of weeks. Creating policies and practices and structures, which is really what your implementation plan is all about, and actually documenting a process so it's actually established as a strategy rather than just a whole series of hopes and ideas. And again, establishing an environment where students have agency, where students actually have a voice and their decisions have got value, where they could actually overrule teachers or other leadership processes. That's when they have a true voice. If it's just getting their ideas and opinions, but being able to overrule them and them having no real say, it's very different in terms of agency. But again, it can be challenging because students by their very nature are immature and are not necessarily going to have their long-term perspective on what's in their best interest. But a good supportive, trusting environment acknowledges that. And students will understand that there are certain parameters where for some things that they'll be given voices, but other things they may not be given as much. But that's all a fluid process. Okay, having, excuse me, cycles of transformation. Now, this is an important one that you need to consider, and one of the things that actually differentiates between really good implementation plans and fairly mediocre ones. You're not going to be able to achieve everything at once. And having processes in place whereby you develop some aspects and then they lead on in terms of laying the groundwork to develop more ambitious aspects, which in turn lead on to developing even more ambitious aspects. But having the forethought to plan out that that process will occur is a really challenging part of implementation planning. It's quite difficult, and yeah, it's difficult to achieve until you've done a number of these processes, but it's something that you do need to be aware of. I don't expect everyone to achieve this because it is very complex, but having a process whereby there is a series of cycles that build upon one another towards achieving really complex, ambitious goals is a good aspect of any good implementation plan. And then the final one is to actually utilize 21st century tools and resources. So utilizing tools to assist in the planning process. So there's lots of online tools for managing big projects. Maybe having an entire management system, online management system, that's just focusing around supporting the project, around teacher professional development, around keeping track of all the different elements of the implementation plan, making sure that everyone can get access to all those elements and modify them and change them, having online discussions and conferences to facilitate working across large areas, or working with international partners and all those aspects. So while we talk a lot about using ICTs to assist students learning, we can also use a lot of ICTs to assist in the running and management and dynamic application of these planning processes inside your educational organisations. Okay, so what are your thoughts around some of those ideas?
Are you kind of talking about like the change management process? Is that online?
It is to a certain extent. Change management is a little bit different. This is really the processes of innovation and how innovations build upon innovations that will incorporate change management. But change management is more about the way of getting everyone on board with a change and being supportive of that change. Here we're talking more about the cyclical process of innovation, where one step of innovation, you can't go straight to the final goal, and you need to go through a range of steps in order to achieve that goal. But as much as possible, you should think through what is needed at each of those stages, and to ensure that the first stage, for example, provides all the foundational elements of the second stage. And then all the elements of the second stage are provided for the third stage. Of course, if you've got a plan for that, but you then leave out an important aspect, say teacher professional development, which is often left out, then you may not be able to achieve the second stage. You may not even be able to achieve the first stage, but you definitely won't be able to achieve the second stage, because that's a foundational element for something that's required in that second stage process.
So this is probably what you're talking about is more like what the actions are that you're going to do. Is that what you mean? Yes,
but it could be around developing up cultures. So in order to achieve certain things, you may have to change the culture of the environment. And then once that culture is changed, then it may open up a whole lot of opportunities to do a whole lot of new things. But you may not even be able to start with, say, good professional development until you build trust. And that may be part of the first stage. If it's a dysfunctional environment where you've got to achieve that first. So once that's achieved, then you can go to the second stage, where it may be around professional development. And then the third stage may be, once all the skills are established with the staff, you can then start transforming the learning environment. That could be a very simple staged approach. And yes, MBA environments, a lot of these things are brought from industry, that's used in multiple industries. And it is around about management of people and resources and approaches to the use of all the things we incorporate into learning environments. Which document, this one, are we reading? We're reading Creating Your Roadmap to the 21st Century. Have you, hopefully you would have been seeing that appear on the screen when I've been sharing it. Otherwise, what I've been saying may be a bit out of context. Okay, good. Okay, so let's look at the last section. I think it's the last section. Yes, your infrastructure. Now, this is one many of you focused on in your first assignment, and it's an important one. Of course, you need good infrastructure to be able to achieve many of the outcomes that we've been describing. So the first one that many of you have talked about is around your internet connections, your bandwidth, and the ability to be able to engage with online resources and all the rest that goes with that. But also around the devices that may be available for you to be able to utilize in the schooling environment, be they PCs or laptops or tablets or other mobile devices. and the ratio of access to those. Are they shared devices? Do all students have access to their own devices? And all those elements that you are all fairly well aware of. Part of that is around technical support. Some technologies are getting to the stage where we don't need an awful lot of technical support, and universities have really sort of reached that stage. But in many schools, there's still a strong need for technical support to address many of the difficulties that people come up with in accessing the internet or the use of devices and other IT-related resources. Professional learning about how to use the infrastructure in terms of the technologies and the resources that they've got access to. Whole areas of concepts around security and data privacy, particularly important in our public schools, where that can often restrict learning opportunities because security and data privacy are treated very seriously and may not allow access to some of the tools and technologies that we'd like to be able to utilize because they don't meet the requirements of that. And then there's also the physical environment, particularly when we're talking about use of lots of new technologies in older environments which weren't designed for that sort of use. But it can also affect pedagogy. If classrooms are so small that you can only really just fit every student lined up in rows, that makes it difficult for group work and collaborative projects and other aspects. But it can also be around access to electricity for students to recharge their devices, and of course access to the internet and Wi-Fi hotspots and so forth. But there's a whole range of other new elements coming into that at the moment around the decorations in rooms, the CO2 levels, the heating levels and cooling levels, and trying to optimize the spaces to make learning as effective as it possibly can be. So any thoughts around infrastructure? Yes, Emma, there's lots of things to think about.
Goes back to the funding again. It's all about the money.
Yes, funding can be an important aspect, but that may be something you need to incorporate into your implementation plan. And if funding's not readily available, it may be about seeking grants or working collaboratively between schools, sharing of resources. Yeah, there are often solutions if you look for it, but it's an important aspect. And most initiatives do require funding of some nature. But if you can get enough stakeholders on board, and those stakeholders have got the ability to support your initiative financially, that may be an approach that's possible. And certainly many schools do that through alumni and cake drives and PNC raffles and all the rest that have often been the facilitators of new technologies into learning environments.
I like what Eric's saying about updating hardware. We've just had to do that at our school because the hardware is out of date and doesn't support the new stuff anymore, and it's on the way out. So there's also that I think it's every 4 years, maybe 5, that you have to replace something.
It depends upon your organisation. Some work on a 3-year cycle. If you're working in state government and so forth, it's generally a 3-year cycle.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Schools are often 4 years and sometimes 5 years, just simply because of that. And some schools, though, it has to be stretched out even longer. And that's some of the challenges of grant-based funding, particularly as we had with the Digital Revolution grant, because it wasn't recurrent funding. Eventually, that money had to run out. And schools that utilised that and based their strategies purely around that influx of money are now facing significant challenges to try to maintain the level of technology use without that additional funding. Other schools recognise that long-term process, that funding wouldn't be ongoing, and were one of the precursors of the BYOD initiatives and other laptop programs that included other revenue sources, more often than not than the parents. but sometimes leasing programs and other processes to try to spread the costs out. And that's something you do need to consider in your implementation plan as well. If your strategy is to seek a whole lot of seeding investment and buy a whole lot of equipment and then not worry about funding, eventually that equipment has to be replaced. Likewise, increased use of the internet has an ongoing increased cost. And it's fine to say we'll start doing everything online, but that does have a significant cost in terms of infrastructure for the access to the internet.
Question for you, Jason. I don't know if this is slightly off topic or not. For my implementation plan in looking at funding, I've actually called one of the local mines to try and get some information. Can we use, I'm just trying to connect it to stakeholders. Are we able to actually use those types of funding? Like, am I able to use a mine pretty much to see if I could access funding for my implementation plan? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Yes, you can. Okay. Of course, we're working in the wonderful world of academia, and in theory, you can make up whatever you wish to incorporate in. It does need to be reasonably realistic, but if you need an influx of money to implement your grand vision, but what I'm saying in this particular section is you need to think through about, okay, is that going to be recurrent funding? Is it going to be something that you can rely upon year after year, or is it a one-off process? And if it is a one-off process, you need to have some sort of planning in place as to how to address the ongoing, because remember, you've got to implement out to 10 years, how that can be sustained over that period of time. And it may be a staged influx of money. You may not want all the money at the start. Some of your more expensive elements may be in later stages, and how you then, part of that may be, part of your implementation plan will be to build a relationship with an organization such as a mine, so that they see that long-term investment, because they then might see graduates coming out over a 10-year period of time into their workforce and be more interested in supporting particular aspects of your implementation plan if they can see that long-term process. Okay, so that's that document, and it's a nice document that helps you plan out a process, and particularly take note of those stages, because you do need to think through the process of your implementation plans over a period of time, not just as a one-off singular implementation. Now, some of you have been asking questions about this strange concept called socio-ecological modeling. And you've got some readings to help explain what this theoretical concept is. Now, it came from UNESCO, particularly in third world countries and so forth, where they were implementing big reform agendas and having difficulties getting them achieved, because sometimes they were failing. Very often they were failing. And various approaches were developed to try to identify why they were failing. And it really came down to a whole range of factors. And it wasn't just a single factor that you could say, make sure you do this. And they developed this model so that you could identify all the different stakeholders that might be affected by your initiative, and some structural ways of trying to make sure you identify all the key ones and address their particular needs. And it's been used in lots of different contexts, and we're going to look at some of those contexts now. So this first one was around a cancer control program. And they wanted to implement a change in how people engaged with different ways of controlling cancer. And they had to look at all of these different stakeholders. So there was the individual and all the different things related to that individual in terms of their friends, their family, their service provider in terms of their medical practitioners and so forth, and what they called patient navigators, which helped them get through the complex processes of the medical system. And then around that, they had interpersonal relationships. And around that, we had the organizational relationships, all the different organizations they had to interact with, Medicare and health clinics and all these other elements. And around that, they had their wider community, their employer, hospitals, support groups, the media, they might be interested, researchers might be interested, all these other people that could be influenced by what was being attempted. And then around that then was a whole lot of policies. So these were often governmental policies around what could be done around cancer treatments, but there could be international health policies and goals and a whole range of other factors that needed to be considered. So in your cases around your implementation plans, there might be the 21st century goals around student capabilities in terms of employability. There's the curriculum goals of the Australian curriculum. There might be behavioural goals in terms of various outcomes. So lots of different things at that policy level. But then at your community level, there would be employer expectations. There might be businesses such as the mining industry. There could be the media that might be interested in what you're doing. The universities might be interested in researching what you're doing. All those sort of aspects. Then at your organisational level, you might have professional associations, principals and school associations, parent and citizens groups, a whole range of other groups that might be involved. Then you've got the interpersonal level, which might be the teachers and the students, and a whole range of others. So it's really about systems modelling, but looking at it from the perspective of stakeholders and all the different people that might be interested in what's occurring. So that's that model. This one is more of a general one around weight management. So people trying to lose weight have got a whole range of other things that there might be a particular strategy that people are thinking about, how to assist them in terms of losing weight. And to implement that strategy effectively, you need to consider a whole range of different factors. Again, you've got your individual factors, their knowledge of weight loss and health and their attitudes, their skills, their interpersonal relationships with their family and their friends and their social networks, their organizations around their, say, their workplace, or community groups or Weight Watchers groups and all the rest. And that's extending out into the community. And then you've got public policy around health initiatives and things of that nature. So just another example of looking at things from a whole range of stakeholder perspectives. In this case, around an initiative to try to address obesity and other health issues. Now, the next one is a research one around resilience in primary schools. So here we're getting closer to what you're doing, where you're implementing a particular strategy within a school or an educational organization. But in this case, it wasn't a technology strategy. It was a strategy to promote resilience. And this one gets fairly quickly into more research language. So don't spend a huge amount of time unpacking it. But just to show you how, again, they had to consider all the different factors around what was involved in a primary school. Let's have a look at some of them. Okay, so some of the things around language, gender, different communities of where people were born, in terms of ethnic groups, different language groups, different family groupings, community groupings, peer support groups, and a whole range of other things that they considered in building their particular models. Now, they went through a fairly mathematical approach. You don't need to go anywhere near like that. Here's another one by myself. And this one looks at ICT. Now, this wasn't ICT integration in schools. This was actually ICT integration in teacher education, around how some teacher educators weren't necessarily fully engaged with the use of technology. But again, broken into different factors, using slightly different language, but the microsystems are all the different interpersonal groups and individuals. So what an individual teacher might think about the use of technology, or the use of different pedagogies, and how they might also work as groups. So you might have your maths teachers, or you might have your year 5 teachers, or your university language teachers, and they'll all have different perspectives as a group, as well as all their own individual perspectives. And then you've got mesiosystems, which is your institutional factors. So the school itself will have a particular philosophy and history and approach to using technology, and you need to consider how the institution has engaged with technology. Then you've got exosystems, which are at a discipline level. So language teachers as a whole might approach the use of technology in a particular way. Science teachers might be engaged with technology in a particular way. And so you need to consider that factor, because in the main, certain groups are more advanced than others. Technology teachers tend to be really engaged with the latest technologies. Maths teachers are probably one of the more slow to engage with new technologies. They're still sort of engaging with calculators and things of that nature. Arts teachers are a bit different, because some of them are really engaged with technology and some are very much opposed to technology. So there's different groups of disciplines that can be engaged at different levels. And then you've got macro systems, which are the cultural context in a school environment. So it might be your socioeconomic status in the school. So it might be a poor school, and historically they don't have much access to resources. And so the whole idea of actually trying to pursue an engagement with high technology might be something that needs to be culturally changed. It also might be around ideologies, or you've got Montessori schools, which have got a very strong focus around not engaging with technology until certain age levels. But it could just be around emotionally and other aspects where there might have been a lot of recent initiatives happen in the school and they might have failed, and people might not be in a position to engage with a new initiative just at the moment. And so a lot of your implementation plan might be around overcoming some of the history of that environment before you can start engaging with new initiatives. And then the final one, which you don't see a lot in other socioeconomic models, is around chronosystems. This is around how different things might be achieved at different times. Okay, I'll come back to that in a second, Emma. So, for example, you might have a whole lot of teachers that are about to retire. So engaging them with a whole new initiative that's going to take them several years to see fruition may not be the best thing for those teachers to be engaged with at that time. Or you may have a lot of very new teachers who need to be focusing around behavior management and a whole lot of other fundamental skills around teaching before they can start engaging with complex pedagogical approaches. Or, as I said before, it may have been that you've just had a big initiative and it's gone really badly, and there needs to be time before a new approach can be adopted in that environment. Or it may be that the school has gotten on a roll and they're looking for a new initiative, and it's just initiative after initiative, and they just want something new to be able to continue on that process of innovation and development. So that's a range of socioeconomic modeling approaches that you could consider in thinking about your own socioeconomic modeling. In terms of the arts, now I mentioned the arts around, yes, around different disciplines having their own perspectives on a particular innovation. So, for example, particularly in technology, certain disciplines such as, well, English has been one that's really embraced use of technology around storytelling and presentation of and communication. But they haven't really engaged much with any complex mathematical processing. It's not particularly suited for their discipline. The arts is a fairly complex one, because some arts teachers really embrace technology because they see it at the cutting edge of artistic practice, while other arts teachers are very traditionalist and don't want to see engagement with technology because they see it taking away from the development of fundamental core skills in more traditional artworks. So there may need to be different subgroups within an arts discipline to look at how they engage with technology. The whole aspect is around trying to identify different perspectives and groups of perspectives. So yes, you've got lots of individual perspectives, but you've also got collective groups of perspectives. So your parents and citizens groups may have a collective perspective around supporting the school and buying new technology to help initiatives happen in the school. But there may be individuals within that at an individual level, which may need different factors addressed. It may be the chairman of the Parents and Citizens Committee might be really against spending money and wants to try to build up some money to do a building program. So as a whole, the Parents and Citizens group may be very supportive of what you want to see achieved, but an individual in there may need a different strategy because of their particular perspectives. And likewise, as a whole, the teaching staff may be supportive, but there may be individuals in there that need different strategies and approaches. Now, what I want you to do in your assignment is to make up some of those. You can use real cases if you wish, but you can also make up ones. So try to identify some blockers and the strategies that you'll put in place to overcome those, but also where some groups and individuals will be very supportive and may even want to accelerate things quicker than you want to see them accelerated. And in some cases, you may even have to rein people back, particularly if you've got that cyclical developmental process where you want to achieve certain things to enable then other things to be able to be achieved. You may have some groups that want to see everything achieved immediately. That can often be the case with parents, particularly if they've got children in the school where they want to see the fruits of those initiatives happen straight away so that their children get benefits from them. And you may need to get them into that perspective of a long-term planning for the good of the whole organization rather than the immediate gains that their individual child may achieve. But likewise, that perspective may be from individual students who want to see things achieved for their own benefits, but can also be around staff, particularly staff in leadership positions where they want to have things achieved to further their promotional prospects. And you may need to build in processes whereby they can claim credit for certain things so that they can then progress their promotion plans. And that can be a big case for principals. Principals will often want to see things achieved for their promotional aspects around promoting the school, but also promoting their own career development. And a good implementation plan considers those socio-ecological factors and tries to build them in so that everyone gains benefit from the implementation plan. And of course, you can build your own benefits in as well, because you'll also have your own perspectives and aspects that you want to see that will gain advantage for your own socio-economic, ecological perspectives. So, do we have some questions around SEM modeling? I'm not expecting you to go into it in incredible detail. Just as with your systems modeling, you can do it at a good level, or you can go into incredible detail and make it into a fully functioning dynamic model. Same with SEM modeling. You can go into it into a whole range of depth. But what I would like you to see you do is make sure you've considered a range of different levels. So not just all from individuals, for example, or from groups, or from policy level, but think about the different levels and how they'll have different interests and needs. And then try to give some examples of how you're addressing and meeting various key stakeholders that will either inhibit your plan going ahead or be very supportive and become champions of your plan. So, thoughts and comments.
I just really have to get on with writing the assessment, which I have started.
Wonderful to see you've started. And really, you should see that, as with the first assignment, if you complete each step, it all should flow together into a comprehensive plan in the end. You do need to review sections and make sure it all fits together well, but it's fairly hard to go too far wrong if you include all those different aspects that we've been talking about. And yes, headings do make it easier to plan, and that's why we've structured things in this way. Structured writing is a useful approach. That said, this is just one approach to implementation planning around technology, and a fairly structured process. There are many other approaches, as you'll find in lots of different research books and business texts and leadership texts. There's really thousands of different approaches, but this is a fairly well-established series of approaches, particularly ones that are used effectively on a large scale with UNESCO and organizations like that, but also ones that can be scaled down to an individual's classroom or school setting, because that's where most of you are placed. Okay, so I think we covered most of all those readings. I'm just making sure we haven't missed any. Yep. So any questions about your assignment? So Eric asks, analysis of stakeholders' challenges in different levels for the socio-economic model, systems model. Yes, for essentially that's what you're doing, Eric. You're looking at your organization and you're now looking at the stakeholders involved in that organization and what they want to see out of your implementation plan and how your implementation plan achieves that for them. So your systems model will have identified many of the issues and elements of your organization, but now you need to look at the people involved in that system and what structural aspects they need to have included in your planning process so that they are supportive of your plan, or at least not detrimental to your plan. Okay, can I ask you what's the difference between the preferred organization in the 1, 5, and 10 years time and proposed actions? Okay, so you need to have your planning so that it goes over a 10-year period. And what you're doing here is you're describing what will be achieved after 1 year, after 5 years, and after 10 years. And the steps that you're going to take to achieve those 3 stages. So a really, really complex plan might detail things on a yearly basis. That's more than you need to do in this assignment. You only need to do it for 3 stages. What you need to do and what you want to see achieved and how you're going to achieve it after 1 year, what you need to do and what you're going to be able to be achieved after 5 years, and then after 10 years. Yes. So you describe what the organization will hopefully achieve and how you're going to go about doing that. So you can think about it a little bit like your scenarios you did for assignment 1, but you now need to also include in detail how those scenarios will come about. You don't need to refer to your Delphi study, but you can refer to the ideas and incorporate the ideas that you developed in your Delphi study. So they could become part of your initiatives that you want to see achieved. But no, you don't need to go through and detail any aspects of the study itself. 12 references sounds like a good number. Essentially, if you're using the ideas of other people, you need to reference them. If you're just using your own ideas, you don't need to reference them. But a good assignment should show that you've done some research and incorporated some ideas, and 12 would be an appropriate number for this sort of assignment. How about references in the class? Do you want to elaborate on that, Eric? Oh, if you're referring to references to material presented in this course, if you're taking ideas from places such as, say, the Horizon reports, yes, you should reference those. If it's my speaking, if it's stuff that I've said, you don't necessarily need to reference what I've said because I'm the one marking your work. Yeah, so sometimes people go overboard and start referencing me all the time. So that's not necessary. If there's one particular idea that you're basing a whole lot around that was taken from my speaking or my notes, then yes, you could reference that, but don't go overboard with that. Most of your references should come from others. But remember, the key element, if you're trying to show that you've done research, you should probably actually do some research and get some external references. If you're just showing that you've done the readings, that's where you're doing the internal references to material that we've talked about. That's probably not so good. So yes, you can do it if you're really wanting to draw upon things, and the Horizon reports are a good example, and some of the things from the other readings. But I would hope that you would do a little bit of additional research, and not that I think there's any particular marks for that, but it does show better scholarship, that you've actually done some research and read into some areas and incorporated those ideas into your work. Okay, any other questions about the assignment? Otherwise, we'll finish up a bit early and let you get to work on that assignment. Okay then, well, thanks everyone. Remembering that you can answer or ask questions on the discussion forum or via email. And good luck with the rest of your work, and see you again next week for our final session.